The room was charged with an unusual tension. The bright lights above cast a sterile glow across the polished table where two of the most influential figures in America sat. Judge Amy Coney Barrett, a Supreme Court justice known for her composed demeanor, faced Elon Musk, the billionaire entrepreneur whose ventures had reshaped the world. The stage was set for what was supposed to be a routine interview on one of the most watched political talk shows in the nation. But what no one expected, especially Barrett, was that the conversation would take a turn so dramatic that it would send shockwaves through the public. Musk, who was no stranger to controversy, had been invited to discuss his latest venture, something he called the Truth Project. What started as a typical exchange about technology and society quickly morphed into something much more sinister, and it was Barrett who would be caught in the crossfire. As the cameras rolled, the host introduced the topic of the evening: judicial independence and the role of Supreme Court justices in shaping the future. Barrett, always poised, spoke confidently about the importance of preserving the integrity of the judiciary, her words echoing the calm certainty of a woman who had risen to the highest legal office in the land. But Musk wasn't buying it. Not this time. His expression was unreadable, yet something in his eyes hinted at a brewing storm. "You know, Amy," Musk began, his voice steady but laced with an almost calculated edge, "there's a lot we don't know about how decisions like yours are made. I think the public deserves to know." Barrett's eyes narrowed slightly. She had heard the murmurs of Musk's controversial views on governance and politics, but she never expected him to challenge her like this, especially in front of millions of viewers. Was it a setup? A veiled attack on the integrity of the court? The host, sensing the shift in tone, tried to intervene, but Musk raised a hand, signaling for silence. "I'm not saying anything that hasn't been whispered behind closed doors for years," Musk continued, his words gaining weight with every passing second. "But I've seen enough to know that what's really happening behind the scenes isn't as noble as we've been led to believe." Barrett, normally unflappable, stiffened. Her gaze remained fixed on Musk, a mixture of disbelief and growing unease clouding her features. She had always prided herself on her impartiality, her belief in the Constitution, and her duty to uphold the law. But Musk, with his reputation for uncovering uncomfortable truths, had just cracked open a door she had hoped to keep shut. The audience, who had been silent up until this point, now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A murmur rippled through the crowd as they sensed something big was about to happen. "What exactly are you implying?" Barrett finally asked, her voice measured but carrying an undeniable edge. Musk leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto hers. "You've been part of something much larger than you realize, Amy. The very people you work with, the ones who shape decisions that affect millions, are not as transparent as they claim. I know about the deals, the backroom discussions that never make it to the public eye." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "I know what you're hiding, and it's time the world knew too." The words hung in the air, thick with accusation. For a split second it felt as if the world outside the studio had stopped turning. Every eye was now on Barrett, waiting for her response. How would she react to this attack? Would she deny it, brush it off as the ramblings of a provocateur? Or would she confront the truth in a way that would change everything? Barrett's breath caught in her throat. She had always been a defender of truth, but this was different. Musk wasn't just questioning her. He was accusing her of being complicit in something far darker. The room seemed to close in around her as her mind raced to process what he had just said. Was this really happening? Was this the moment her career would be defined by? The host, sensing the rising tension, tried to steer the conversation back on course. But Barrett was already on edge, her grip on the armrest tightening as the weight of Musk's words began to settle. She had never been one to shy away from tough questions, but this was no ordinary interview. This was a direct challenge to everything she stood for. Musk didn't back down. "I've got proof, Amy," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. And, "I'm not going to let this go." A silence filled the air, thick with anticipation. What was Barrett thinking? Would she continue to defend her position? Or was this the moment everything changed? And then it happened. Barrett stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Her face, normally a mask of composure, was now a portrait of barely contained anger. The room held its breath, unsure of what she would do next. Would she engage in a public confrontation? Or would she walk away from the interview altogether? The camera zoomed in, capturing her every movement. For the first time in a long while, the world saw a side of Amy Coney Barrett they had never seen before. Her resolve, so often unshakable, was now on the verge of cracking. "Enough," Barrett said, her voice cold, her eyes flashing with a mix of fury and disbelief. Without another word, she turned on her heel and walked off set, leaving a stunned studio audience behind her. What had just happened? What had Musk uncovered that made Barrett walk away in such dramatic fashion? The world had just witnessed the unraveling of a Supreme Court justice's career, and no one knew where it would lead. Next, as the door to the studio swung shut behind her, the air felt heavier than ever. Amy Coney Barrett had just stormed off the set, leaving behind an audience that sat in stunned silence, trying to comprehend what had just unfolded. Cameras continued, rolling, capturing the aftermath of the unprecedented moment. The host, visibly shaken, turned toward Musk, whose calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the chaos that had just erupted. "Well, that was unexpected," the host murmured, struggling to regain his composure. Musk remained seated, his expression unreadable. The audience could sense the storm brewing within him, even if he didn't show it outwardly. He hadn't expected Barrett to leave so abruptly, but deep down, he knew he had struck a nerve, and he was just getting started. Barrett's departure had been swift and forceful, but it wasn't the end of the story. Far from it. It was only the beginning of a much larger, far-reaching scandal. As the broadcast continued, the host tried to regain control of the situation, shifting his attention back to Musk. But the tension in the room was palpable. What had Musk meant by his cryptic comments about backroom deals and hidden truths? What could he possibly have on Barrett, a Supreme Court justice, that would cause her to flee the set in such dramatic fashion? Meanwhile, outside the studio, Barrett's mind was racing. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly as she made her way to her car. Her heart pounded in her chest, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She had never been in a situation like this before. Never had her authority, her integrity, been so publicly called into question. But Musk's words had cut deeper than anything she had experienced in her career. How could he have known about the things he alluded to? How could he know what had been hidden for so long? She fumbled for her keys, her hands trembling. She needed to leave. She needed to get away from the cameras, from the questions, from the accusations that now seemed to be echoing in her mind. But no matter how fast she moved, she couldn't escape the feeling that something much larger was unraveling. And she was at the center of it all. Back in the studio, the broadcast was still. Live. Musk sat in front of the cameras, the glare of the studio lights highlighting the cold, calculating expression on his face. He knew this moment would be pivotal. He had expected some pushback, but Barrett's reaction had exceeded even his expectations. There was no turning back now. He could already hear the questions flooding in from every corner of the media. What did Musk know? What had Barrett been hiding? Was this the beginning of the end for the Supreme Court justice? Or was there more to this story than anyone realized? As the show continued, Musk leaned forward slightly, addressing the camera with the same deliberate calm he had maintained throughout the interview. "The truth is, we live in a world where transparency is a luxury few can afford," Musk began, his words carefully measured. "And the people who have the most power are the ones who hide the most. What I said tonight, it's just the tip of the iceberg. But if you want to know the full story, you'll have to dig deeper." There was no question about it. Musk was not backing down. He had just thrown a grenade into the public conversation, and he was ready to watch as the pieces fell apart. The cameras continued rolling, but Musk's mind was already elsewhere, calculating the impact of what he had done. He knew that by exposing the corruption that had been silently running through the highest echelons of power, he was making a dangerous move. But it was a move he was prepared for. This wasn't just about one justice. This was about the system itself, a system that, in Musk's view, had grown complacent and rotten. In the days that followed, the world reacted to the interview in waves. Social media exploded with heated debates, articles poured in from every corner of the media, and every major news outlet was covering the fallout. Musk's accusations were everywhere. Some hailed him as a truth-teller, a whistleblower who was daring to reveal what others feared to touch. Others, however, questioned his motives, wondering if his actions were driven by a personal vendetta or a desire for attention. But one thing was certain: the storm had only just begun. And in the midst of all this chaos, Coney Barrett remained silent. She had not made a public statement since her departure from the studio, and the media was clamoring for her response. What would she say? Would she address Musk's allegations head-on, or would she try to weather the storm in silence? Behind closed doors, Barrett was grappling with the gravity of the situation. She had always prided herself on being above reproach, on maintaining the highest standards of integrity and honor. But now, her reputation, and perhaps her career, was in jeopardy. The pressure was mounting, and the walls were closing in. Would she be able to weather this storm, or was this the beginning of the end for one of the most prominent figures in American law? As the days passed, the pressure only intensified. The story wasn't just about a single interview anymore. It had become a national conversation. People were asking questions that no one wanted to answer, and Musk's words were echoing in the halls of power. The truth, it seemed, was coming for everyone, and no one could outrun it. As the days passed, the media frenzy surrounding Coney Barrett and Elon Musk only intensified. The story had reached a fever pitch. News anchors, columnists, and pundits all weighed in, each adding their voice to the growing cacophony of speculation and accusation. The question on everyone's mind was the same: what had Musk meant when he claimed to have proof of corruption and secrecy in the Supreme Court? Barrett, meanwhile, had not spoken publicly since her dramatic departure from the set. Her silence was deafening, only fueling the frenzy surrounding her. Every day, the media bombarded her with requests for interviews, statements, and comments. But Barrett remained resolute, refusing to address the storm head-on. Behind closed doors, however, the pressure was mounting. The phone calls were constant, the messages flooding in from every direction. There were whispers that the White House had been in contact, urging her to say something, anything, to calm the waters. But Barrett knew that whatever she said would only add fuel to the fire. The accusations Musk had leveled against her were explosive, and no matter how she tried to spin it, the damage had already been done. But what was the truth? What had Musk uncovered that had sent Barrett into a tailspin? The answer was elusive, hidden behind layers of secrecy and power that stretched far beyond her understanding. She had spent years on the bench making decisions that affected millions, but now she was the one under scrutiny. The pressure was taking its toll. Barrett had always been a woman of conviction, but even she could feel the cracks starting to show. She had dedicated her life to the law, to justice, to upholding the Constitution. But now she wondered if that commitment had been misplaced. Had she unknowingly become part of a system that was not as pure as she had always believed? As she sat alone in her office, staring at the stacks of legal briefs in front of her, Barrett's mind wandered back to the moment that had started it all. The moment she had stormed off the set. The memory was still fresh in her mind. The shock and betrayal of Musk's accusations echoing in her ears. She had never imagined that her career, her entire life's work, would be thrown into such turmoil by a single interview. But here she was, caught in the crosshairs of a battle that was much larger than she had ever anticipated. Musk, on the other hand, was basking in the aftermath of his actions. The media was eating up his every word, and his followers were celebrating him as a hero, a champion of truth who was willing to expose the corruption that had plagued the highest echelons of power. But beneath the surface there was something more, a sense of inevitability that Musk had been preparing for this moment for years. He knew the risks. Exposing the truth, especially about something as powerful as the Supreme Court, would have consequences. But he also knew that the world was ready for a reckoning. The public was tired of the lies, tired of the secrecy, and Musk was more than willing to be the one to deliver the truth, no matter the cost. But as the days wore on, cracks began to appear in Musk's own armor. The pressure was mounting on him as well. The media was beginning to question his motives. Was he really trying to uncover the truth? Or was he simply using the drama to elevate his own profile? Even some of his supporters began to ask whether his crusade was less about justice and more about self-interest. The lines between hero and villain were blurring, and Musk was walking a razor-thin line. Still, Musk pressed forward, refusing to back down. He knew that Barrett's silence was just as telling as anything she could say. The longer she remained quiet, the more the public would question her. The longer the truth remained hidden, the more dangerous the situation became. Musk knew he couldn't stop now. The truth needed to come out, no matter who it hurt. Barrett, on the other hand, was beginning to crack under the pressure. She had spent days trying to ignore the storm raging around her, but it was impossible. The whispers were growing louder, the questions more insistent. What had she been a part of? What had Musk uncovered? She had always believed in the rule of law, but now she was starting to wonder if the system itself was broken. And then, just when it seemed that the story was beginning to die down, Musk dropped a bombshell, one that would change everything. In an exclusive interview with a major news outlet, Musk revealed that he had more than just words. He had documents, hard evidence, that would expose the true extent of the corruption within the judiciary. He didn't give many details, but what he did say was enough to send shockwaves through the political establishment. "I have what I need," Musk said, his tone unwavering. "The public deserves to know the truth, and I'm going to make sure they do. There's no turning back now." The reaction was swift. News outlets scrambled to cover the story, and social media erupted in a frenzy of speculation. The question was no longer whether Musk had the truth. It was what would happen when the full extent of the corruption was revealed. In that moment, the stakes had been raised. Barrett could no longer hide behind silence. The truth was coming, and it was going to change everything. The weight of the world now hung heavily on Coney Barrett. Musk's latest revelation had sent shockwaves across the nation, stirring a mixture of fear, anger, and disbelief in those who had long trusted the institutions that governed them. The documents Musk had alluded to were circulating. Whispers of their contents spread like wildfire, though few had seen them firsthand. But the mere possibility that Musk had proof, tangible evidence that could shake the foundation of American law, sent ripples of panic through the corridors of power. Barrett knew what was coming. Her name had been dragged through the mud in the wake of Musk's accusations, but now the situation was escalating beyond anything she had ever imagined. The calls for her resignation were growing louder. The press was on a relentless hunt for any scrap of information that could further implicate her, any hint of corruption or misdeeds that could tarnish her legacy. But the deeper she dug into her own memories, the more she realized. She had always believed she was above reproach. Had she been wrong? Had she been blind to something far more sinister? It was in the quiet of her office, surrounded by the very legal texts she had once revered, that Barrett's internal battle reached its peak. She had spent her career fighting for justice, holding fast to principles of fairness and integrity. But now, The very justice she had sworn to protect seemed to be slipping through her fingers. She couldn't ignore it any longer. The truth, no matter how painful, had to be confronted. Barrett reached for her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she dialed the number of one of her closest confidants, a former colleague who had been with her through some of her most challenging moments. As the phone rang, she tried to steady her thoughts. She had never been one to seek advice or comfort, but this situation was unlike anything she had faced. She needed to know what to do. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was familiar, reassuring in its calmness. "It's Amy," Barrett said, her voice tight. "I need to talk." The next few minutes passed in a blur as Barrett outlined everything that had happened. The interview, the accusations, the mounting pressure. She didn't leave anything out. Her confidant listened in silence, the weight of the situation settling between them as she spoke. "You need to make a decision," her colleague finally said, breaking the silence. "You can't keep running from this. The truth is already out there. The longer you stay silent, the worse it's going to get." Barrett felt a wave of frustration rise within her. She had known that the pressure would come to this point, but hearing it from someone else only made it feel more real. The decision wasn't simple. To speak out would be to admit that something had gone terribly wrong. But if she remained silent, she risked being swept away in a tide of rumors and half-truths. "I know," Barrett whispered. "I know what I have to do." The conversation ended, but the decision had been made. Barrett had to face the truth, whatever it was, and address the accusations head-on. The public was waiting for her to speak. They were demanding answers. She couldn't hide anymore. And so, she did what few in her position would ever do. She called a press conference. The day of the conference arrived, and the air seemed thick with anticipation. Cameras were set up outside the courthouse where Barrett would speak, and reporters milled around, their voices hushed, their eyes trained on the entrance. The story had gone global. Every news outlet was covering it. The world was watching to see how Barrett would respond to Musk's accusations and whether she would confront the truth or attempt to deflect it. As Barrett stepped out into the bright lights of the press conference, she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She had been in countless public appearances before, but this time was different. This time, the stakes were higher. The truth, whatever it was, would come out in this room. She took her place behind the podium, her face set in a mask of stoic determination. The cameras clicked and flashed as reporters scrambled to get a glimpse of the woman at the center of the storm. Barrett knew the questions were coming. They would be relentless, probing, and unforgiving. But she had made her choice. She cleared her throat, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, but filled with an undeniable gravity. "I stand before you today, not as a Supreme Court justice, but as a person who has dedicated her life to justice, to fairness, and to the rule of law. The accusations that have been leveled against me are serious. I do not take them lightly." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to sink in. "But let me be clear. I will not run from this. I will not be intimidated into silence. The truth will come out, and I will answer for my actions. I have always believed in transparency, in accountability, and in doing what is right. And today, I am here to ensure that the truth is told, no matter where it leads." The room was silent. Every reporter, every camera, every eye in the room was fixed on her, waiting for the next words to come. The tension was palpable. Barrett's voice never wavered as she continued. "Yes, I know about the conversations, the backroom deals. But the truth you seek isn't what you think. The corruption you claim to expose, the secrets you think you've uncovered, it's not what it seems. There's more to this story, and I am ready to tell it." The crowd erupted in a flurry of questions, but Barrett raised her hand, signaling for silence. "You will hear the truth," she said, her gaze unwavering. "But first, I need you to understand something. This is bigger than any one person. It's about the system that has allowed power to be concentrated in the hands of a few. The very system I've spent my life defending is the same one that has kept the truth hidden for far too long. Musk is right about one thing: change is coming. And with those words, the storm that had been brewing for days reached its full intensity. Barrett had finally done what many thought impossible. She had confronted the truth, and with it, the very future of her career, and the Supreme Court hung in the balance. The room buzzed with an intensity that felt like it could crack the very walls. Every journalist present was scrambling to process the implications of Barrett's statement. For days they had speculated, theorized, and debated, wondering how this confrontation would unfold. But now the Supreme Court justice had done what many had thought impossible. She had broken her silence, and in doing so, she had opened a door that no one had expected her to open. The questions came fast and furious. What do you mean, Justice Barrett? What exactly is it that you're acknowledging? Are you saying Musk's accusations are true? What backroom deals are you referring to? Who else is involved? The room exploded with chaos. Each reporter desperate to be the one to pull the truth from Barrett, to unravel the tangled web that had only grown more complicated since Musk had exposed the cracks in the system. Barrett stood tall, unflinching, her eyes locked on the cameras as if daring anyone to challenge her. "You will all have the answers in time," she said, her voice steady. "But understand this: I am not the villain here. The truth is far more complicated than any of you realize. The system I have spent my life serving was built on compromises, on decisions made behind closed doors. And yes, I was part of that system. But I did not create it." For a moment the room fell silent. It was as if the very air itself had been sucked out, leaving only the weight of Barrett's words to hang in the balance. Musk, who had been watching the press conference from a nearby studio, leaned forward in his chair. He had known this moment was coming. Barrett's admission was the beginning of the unraveling he had been pushing for all along. But the public wasn't satisfied with half-truths. They wanted more. Musk had already made his claims, had already painted Barrett as a key figure in a corrupt system. Now the world was watching to see whether Barrett would follow through on her promises, whether she would reveal the full extent of what she knew. "Are you suggesting that there is a deeper conspiracy at play here?" another reporter asked, his voice cutting through the silence. "That the entire justice system is compromised?" Barrett took a deep breath, her gaze unwavering. "The system is flawed. It always has been. There are powerful forces at work, behind closed doors, influencing decisions in ways most people will never see. But that doesn't mean we are all guilty. I am guilty of being a part of that system, but not of the corruption Musk has accused me of." Her words were measured, calculated. She wasn't backing down, but she wasn't throwing herself fully under the bus either. There was something more beneath the surface, something that wasn't being said, something that could turn the tide in her favor. But it wasn't time yet to reveal all. Not just yet. Outside, the media frenzy had reached new heights. Headlines screamed about the revelations that were still to come. Social media platforms buzzed with debate. Was Barrett a hero finally exposing the rot at the heart of the judicial system? Or was she simply trying to cover her tracks? The question of her culpability had transformed into something even more complex. Barrett was no longer just the accused. She was also a whistleblower, a player in a larger game. Musk, meanwhile, was watching the spectacle unfold with a quiet intensity. The world was finally paying attention. He had known this moment would come, and now that Barrett had stepped forward, the pieces were falling into place. It was never just about her. It was about the bigger picture. The entire system that had been built on secrets, on hidden deals, on unspoken alliances. Barrett wasn't the only one who had played a part, and Musk, for all his public bravado, knew there were others, other influential figures who were just as complicit, just as deeply embedded in the tangled web of power that had governed the nation's judicial system for decades. But Barrett was the one in the spotlight now, and Musk wasn't going to let her off the hook. Not yet. She's speaking the truth, but it's not the whole truth, Musk said to his team, his voice low but resolute. She's giving the public just enough to keep them satisfied for now, but she's holding back the real revelations. We need to push harder. We need to make sure the full extent of this gets out. For all her attempts at controlled transparency, Barrett knew the world was waiting for her next move. The pressure on her was suffocating, and though she had begun to speak, the truth she knew that once the floodgates opened, there would be no turning back. She had already walked too far down this path to retreat. Over the next few days, Barrett's internal struggle intensified. She could feel the walls closing in as the media, the public, and even her colleagues pressed for answers. She had promised to reveal the truth, but now that the moment had arrived, the full weight of what she was about to expose hit her. She was no longer just a judge. She was an agent of change, whether she was ready for it or not. But just as the pressures seemed unbearable, something remarkable happened. The public, far from condemning her, began to rally behind her. The revelation that she was willing to speak out, to acknowledge the flaws in the system, resonated with millions of Americans who had long felt disconnected from the powerful elite. In that moment, Barrett found her redemption. Her final press statement came just days later, in a calm, assured voice. "I have seen the cracks in the system, and I have made mistakes. But I will not stand by while the truth is buried any longer. The time for change is now." It wasn't a grand triumph, but it was enough. The public's trust in her was restored, and while the truth was still unfolding, Coney Barrett had reclaimed her dignity. The battle was not over, but the first steps toward true reform had been taken. The storm that had started with Musk's explosive claims had finally begun to subside. But it was clear that the winds of change had swept through Washington, leaving a new landscape in its wake. And for the first time in a long while, the people believed that real justice, perhaps even true reform, might finally be within reach.